So this is a couple days late, and part of it is because I am a horrible, selfish person who found out that Zumbinis is on Steam, and I've been doing that for the last 2 days. So I also had the flu, which sucked and hurt. Everything hurt. I was not into it. I had a fever. I had to work through that. No. Don't recommend. If you can avoid, please avoid. But Gretchen did her wrap up on Monday, and while I'm doing this on Sunday, it's still technically mine. I'm gonna have this go out this week. I swear to God it's gonna come out this week. So I read 4 books in January and completed 4 books for my Pop Sugar reading challenge. I think what I'm going to do is give sort of small-ish discussion-y type things on all of them, with maybe a little bit more detail and things that I'm not planning on doing like a full review for or adding into another video of some kind. Which I think really only applies to this first one. The first book I read this year was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which a lot of you might remember from childhood. It was super popular in like the late 90s, early 2000s type like elementary schools. They have repackaged and re-released those, so I saw it in my kids section and had to grab it. I'm gonna put a cover for both the old one and the new one on either side of me. Hopefully I'm not in the way. This fulfilled the challenge of a book that you loved as a child, and I obviously am a super huge horror fan. I've talked about it before. This in particular was one of the iconic series that I remember like really starting along with Goosebumps, and I don't know if kids today still read them or are interested in them. If not, kind of a shame, because they were one of the best things ever for me. The thing that I forgot about them is that they are actually like a how-to guide of telling scary stories. So there's parenthetical insertions that tell you what you should be doing when reading the story aloud. And there's a good mixture of things that are like jump scares and things that are more creepy, and then even some stories that sort of have a funny ending that you think are going to be scary but then end in a very humorous way. I forgot all about that, and I actually sort of like it better this way. It isn't just a random collection of short stories that are scary. It's actually meant to sort of foster community and friendship in kids. Like, it's something to do with your friends. It's not just a solitary thing, which is an interesting thing to do with a book. I wanted to talk about the art in this as well, because they did change it from the original art throughout the text, and while perhaps the most haunting thing of those books growing up was the like art that was just uncanny, and this is a much more palatable art style, I still really like it. It's not going to stick with me in the same way that that original art style would. I'm not going to remember those images forever, but they fit and they're more subtle. So you could look at them and be like, that's a pleasant enough picture, and then once you read the story, you realize that that picture is not so pleasant anymore, and it isn't creepy in its own. It definitely plays off of the story and needs the story to give it like life. If you have a little one who loves scary stories, or maybe is not sure of scary stories, it might be something to do with them. Read it to them and talk about them. The story that like still hits me to this day that I remember about the high beams is in that guy. It's in that first book, and like I sometimes at night sit there thinking like, dang, that was like a very anxiety-inducing story that has stuck with me throughout my life. The second book that I read this year was The Magician's Land, and Gretchen talked about it. There's a whole book club video about how much we disliked that. If you want full details on my thoughts on the series, we've done a whole thing. We had issues with the series, and despite it being a roller coaster of emotions that ultimately ended with boredom, which is maybe the last thing I was expecting, it's something that generated really good discussion, So it at least has that value, but it's definitely not something that I would like set up as like one of the best series ever, like a novel sci-fi series. It isn't, unless what you're looking for in your sci-fi series is vomit-inducing characters. Not into it. That's all I'm going to say on the subject, other than it also stood for a book involving a mythical creature for Pop Sugar. The third book I read this year is actually going to be part of my video next week. It is Moon Called by Patricia Briggs. Some of you might recognize this as the first book in the Mercy Thompson series, and it is the first book in a series I haven't read before. Pop Sugar Challenge number 3 completed. Mercy Thompson came recommended to me from a couple of my friends, and it is the third in a trilogy of urban fantasy series that I wanted to discuss and compare and contrast in a video, which again, that's what I plan to do for Friday. I actually really liked it. I had some issues with it here and there, but reading urban fantasy again, like, I realize how much I really love it as sort of my popcorn read, that it has elements to it that I really enjoy, without having the like kind of mushy gushy stuff that paranormal romance does. It's less cookie cutter, and that's one of the things I'm going to discuss, is this guy compared to Dresden Files, compared to the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter novels. So if you like violence and supernatural creatures, urban fantasy friends, this is where you should be hanging out. The last book that I read is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. It's been on promotion in our store for a while. I know that it's highly acclaimed. It's going to be a movie this year, which I think is the challenge that it fulfills. Yes, a book that's becoming a movie in 2017, so there we go. Wonder, it revolves around a young boy who is born with a facial deformity, and it starts from his perspective where he's discussing it. It switches perspectives to some of the people in his life, like his friends and also his sister, and it does touch on how this affects all of them in very profound ways, but also in less profound ways. I found it very real in the idea that people were being selfish and people were nervous and like trying to protect themselves, but ultimately at the end what it all came down to was choosing kindness over anything else. And I think that's a really great message to put out towards kids, as well as a really great book to talk about inclusion and just in general. In our society today, people are living with these deformities because they have the ability to get surgeries that extend their life far past where they were in the past, and kids will be interacting with and seeing people who look different because of weird anomalies in their genes or something else that had to do with their formation and birth. And they need to understand that that's okay, and that they're not different from anybody else, and that they're a valid human being and not a target. So this is definitely a good one for that. I don't know if I loved it. I feel like in a way there were parts of it that I definitely didn't enjoy, partially the structure, but also a couple other things that were really small and nitpicky and not necessary to argue. So pros and cons, guys. It does a lot really well, and it does some stuff that I'm like, So yes, those are the books that I read in January, as well as the challenges I completed. I have yet to finish a book in February, but I'm really close to finishing a bunch. Part of it is because a lot of them are buddy reads, and the other part of it is that I haven't been reading on my own. Like, I've been very interested in reading aloud to Gretchen, having Gretchen read to me, reading aloud to Taylor, but like the solitary act of sitting and reading, I haven't done all that much. I did read a fair amount of Bird by Bird, which I think is going to be the first book that I finish this month, but we shall see. We shall see. I hope that you guys had a good week. Sorry this guy is late. I will see you on Friday. Fingers crossed that I don't get sucked into the Zumbinis hole again. And that's all I got. Bye.